Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host this week, and as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So, Joe, this week, one of our previous episodes has been brought forcefully back to mind. It is wildfire season here in the Pacific Northwest, and we've had a cloud of smoke hanging over us all week long. And it always happens that the smoke hits on the hot and muggy days. So the days when you can't have the doors or windows open and you've got the air purifier going are the days when it's just sweltering inside. So it's been a struggle.
Yeah, a few days ago in New York, it was hazy, and they said it was because of the western wildfires. But are they reaching up all the way into Washington near you?
Yeah, we got a couple fires that are actually in Washington. There's actually a pretty small one that has just this narrow tendril of smoke, but is directly pointed at Seattle. It's like that smoke has it out specifically for Seattle. And so we've just been kind of suffering through that. So, But hopefully it'll clear up pretty soon.
Yeah, and since you plugged our podcast about that, let me just say it's episode 6. We taped it a couple of years ago, but it's about western wildfires and the connection with climate change, and I think it's still relevant today. So check it out, folks.
Yeah, it certainly is not a problem that's going away. And speaking of problems that aren't going away, there is the whole question of educational reform in this country. And one of the things that I really like about this podcast and the time that we've been doing it is it gives me a chance to go back and examine questions that have been hanging around in the back of my head for years and years and years. And this is one of them.
Me too.
Because about 10 years ago, I worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And one of their primary areas of investment is in U.S. education, because the U.S. famously spends a lot on education, but gets pretty middle-of-the-road outcomes. Most European countries have better educational outcomes for the kids than we do. And I remember when I was at the foundation, they talked a lot about these great charter schools in the inner city that would be taking in poor Black kids and just producing amazing results in terms of sending those kids on to college. And then when I got out of the foundation and moved on to another employer, I started to hear from progressive sources in this area about how much they hated charter schools. And they just seemed to hate everything about them. They talked about billionaires and right-wing plots, and it seemed this weird disjunction from what I've heard before, which is that charter schools are an interesting opportunity to experiment with education and figure out ways of doing it better. So I sent you down this rabbit hole, Joe, to find out what the deal was with charter schools. And what did you discover?
Yeah, well, this one I wouldn't consider a rabbit hole, because I too have been very interested in this question for years. I did a lot of reading and thinking about it long before you asked me about it. Let me just tease my later answer with 3 words: divide and conquer. And I will come back to that and explain the significance of that at the end.
Okay.
I want to also mention up front that my sister-in-law was part of a group that started a charter school in the Center City section of Philadelphia more than a couple decades ago. I had a chance to pick her brain about that experience then and now, and that really helped me to refine my own views on the subject. Her name is Becky, and I just want to thank her for sharing her thoughts with me, which I'm going to cite throughout this episode.
Okay. Is Becky a listener?
Yes, she is in fact a listener, and she'll be especially excited to listen to this one, I hope. To start, let's make sure everyone knows what a charter school is. Public education is managed by states and localities with federal oversight. Charter schools are public schools that receive government funding but operate independently of the state system. Most are run by privately owned for-profit management companies, although there are some nonprofits as well. Their structure and rules are based on legislation that differs from state to state. A charter school is authorized to commence operations only after receiving its charter, which is basically a performance contract typically lasting 3 to 5 years, that details things like the school's mission, its program and goals, how it will be organized and managed, the students it's designed to serve, what those students are expected to achieve, its assessment methods, and the ways it proposes to measure success. As long as they satisfy the terms of their charters, charter schools are largely exempt from the laws and regulations affecting other public schools. Charter schools are a relatively recent innovation in education policy. Though public education has been available in the United States since the days of Horace Mann in the mid-19th century, charter schools weren't even theorized until 1971. They were originally conceived as legally and financially autonomous public schools, and by public, I mean open to anyone who wants to attend, not charging tuition, and without religious affiliation. As for taking all comers, Becky told me that in Pennsylvania, the state law is that charters have to take any child who applies, and if the school is over-enrolled with even one more applicant than the number of available seats, it has to implement an admissions lottery. I think it's ironic that the charter school movement is seen by so many progressives today as a right-wing plot to undermine public schools, because it was originally a progressive movement.
Right.
In the 1960s, many unionized teachers and principals complained about the lack of innovation and the ossified bureaucracy at the local Board of Ed. They clamored for more control over their schools and more flexibility in their educational methods. Charter schools were developed in part to satisfy those demands. The small schools movement, started by people like University of Massachusetts professor Ray Budde and American Federation of Teachers Union President Albert Shanker, was originally intended to explore best practices for education without bureaucracy. Shanker, in particular, hoped both to empower teachers and to integrate the schools. In the 1980s, as the small schools paradigm came to fruition, many gigantic high schools in big cities like New York were split into multiple smaller campuses, often arranged by subject area, and that decentralization set the stage for the charter school movement that we know today. Charter schools can be found all over the world, but I limited my research for this podcast to the United States. And Mark, you want to take a guess at the first state in the nation to pass a charter school law?
Wild guess. I'm just going to say Massachusetts.
That's a good guess. I would have guessed California, but it's neither one of the two. It was Minnesota in 1991. Mm-hmm. California was actually second in 1992. So we're talking about a phenomenon that's actually laws that were actually passed only 30 years ago. But as an illustration of how charter schools have grown since then, by 2015, Minnesota had 165 registered charter schools serving 41,000 students. Nationwide, as of the 2019-2020 school year, so right before the pandemic, there were more than 7,700 charter schools serving more than 3.4 million students, with additional hundreds of thousands on wait lists. Collectively, charter schools now enroll 7.2% of all public school students.
Wow, that's more than I would have guessed.
Yeah, me too. That's why I'm citing that stat. Two of our bigger cities, New Orleans and Cleveland, send a majority of their school children to charter schools. In the case of New Orleans, it's 99%.
Holy cow.
Yeah. I think that's the combination of a city that's got a large, impoverished and low income population and a red state that's willing to take chances like that. Mm. There are 44 states plus Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and Guam that have passed legislation authorizing charter schools. The 6 states that don't yet have charter school laws are Kentucky, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Vermont. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which was President George W. Bush's signature education legislation, was a major driver in the growth of charter schools in America in a couple of ways. First, it specified that the students attending underperforming schools had the right to transfer to another school in their district, whether public, private, or charter. And second, it suggested that if a failing public school didn't show adequate progress, it could be designated as a charter school. Charter schools are funded by the same state and local tax dollars that support regular public schools. And I'll get into that much more later in this presentation, but right now I want to say that fact doesn't mean there's funding equity. A 2010 study found that charters received 36% less revenue per student than what their district counterparts got. Like so many of the metrics around charter schools, this data point is misleading if taken out of context, because some charters don't enroll a proportionate number of students requiring special ed or other student support services, while others aren't required to provide nutrition services or transportation to and from school. In other words, they do get less money, but they get less money in some cases for good reasons because they don't do as many things as regular public schools do.
Got it.
But while we're on the lack of funding, another thing charter schools don't receive is money earmarked for facilities and special programs within their districts. Becky characterized Pennsylvania's charter school law as an unfunded mandate and told me the city of Philadelphia deleted funds for capital expenses from its award to the charter she co-founded, which started out in a converted office space. They had to scramble to receive grants and private donations in order to buy the abandoned school building that they eventually ended up in. I think that story underscores the necessity for some charter schools to supplement their public funding with donations from individuals and private philanthropies.
Yeah.
It's true that in some cases, private funding pushes the total per pupil spending above that in regular public schools, but that's the exception. The basic concept behind charter schools involves a trade-off. They receive greater autonomy in return for greater accountability. Charters operate free from many of the usual state and district regulations, and there's purposeful flexibility in the way they're required to meet some benchmarks, especially in the areas of hiring, teacher contracts, and curriculum. For example, charters are permitted to focus on teacher performance over seniority. In just a 3-year period between 2009 and 2012, the percentage of charters implementing performance-based compensation increased from 19% to 37%, while the percentage of unionized teachers decreased from 12% to 7%.
Yeah.
Not having a unionized workforce doesn't necessarily mean that pay and benefits are worse for teachers and charters. Becky told me that her charter school modeled its pay scale after the Philadelphia public schools so as not to lose teachers to the public system, which they correctly viewed as the competition.
Sure.
Some innovations pioneered by charter schools include longer school days, extended school years, private tutoring on site, and fresh approaches to teacher training. I think it's fair to say that charters are laboratories where innovative practices in teaching and learning can be developed, which often happens with successful charters.
Right.
The school Becky was part of launched with a Spanish immersion program that has since been copied by other schools, and my 2 nieces are fluent in Spanish because of it. Man, I wish I had studied Spanish in school instead of French.
I studied German, which served me well in graduate school and has not done a single thing for me since.
Anyway, in exchange for all that flexibility, charters are strictly accountable to their sponsors, which range from state education agencies to universities, local school districts, and even cities. Of course, charters are also accountable to the families who choose them and the public that funds them. Accountability comes particularly in the areas of student performance, fiscal practices like how they manage their budgets, and how well they adhere to the terms of their charters. There are countless studies comparing charter schools to regular public schools, both descriptively and with regard to educational outcomes. I could spend all our time today just talking about those comparisons, but here are some general takeaways. Charters are primarily new schools that tend to be smaller than regular public schools, often housing fewer than 200 students. They enroll fewer students with special needs or limited proficiency in English than the average school in their state. They tend to exist in urban rather than rural areas. They tend to be more racially diverse and serve more disadvantaged minority and low-income students. More than half of charters serve student populations where over 60% qualify for the federal lunch program. If you look strictly at test scores, urban charters appear to be a good alternative for minority students in poor neighborhoods, but students in suburban charters serving a mostly white middle-class population perform no better than their counterparts in suburban public schools.
Yeah. Is that, do you think, a measure of the performance of charter schools or a measure of the failure of public schools, where poor inner-city public schools are notoriously poor performing, whereas your average middle-class white school in the Midwest would probably be doing about average? And so
Yeah.
it's less hard for a public school in that scenario to match what a charter school will do.
Yeah, in the case of the inner city schools, I think it's a combination of a better charter school and a crappy public school. In the suburbs, I think it's probably mostly a factor of really good public schools to begin with. So you'd have to be a sensational charter school to do better than the public schools.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But of course, these results I just cited, we just talked about, are not uniform across the country, which is to be expected when there isn't one set of rules and regulations in place. The Wikipedia article on charter schools in the USA, citing national studies done by the Center for Research on Educational Outcomes, stated that, quote, charter schools showed a significantly greater variation in quality between states and within states. Arizona charter students had a 29-day disadvantage in math compared to public school students, but charter school students in D.C. had a 105-day advantage over their peers in public schools. So that's a pretty major fluctuation.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what's at the root of that.
Yeah. You might think the obvious solution to wide variations in quality would be to close charters that fall short of the public schools in their districts, but this is often hard to do. In theory, charter schools can be closed for failing to live up to their charters, but in practice, this takes a long time and can be difficult and controversial. Charter school proponents argue that struggling charters are not given the same opportunity to restructure that traditional public schools receive and are instead shut down when students perform poorly on standardized tests, which arguably undercuts their original mission to provide a different/better educational experience for students. That seems unfair to me.
Yeah, I suppose the flip side argument to that is that their charter is to provide a better education, and you could think of that as something that's not going to be captured in standardized scores, but it also kind of needs to be measurably better. Otherwise, you're never going to know whether it meets its charter. So if they're arguing that standardized scores are a poor measure of their outcomes, I wonder what measure of the outcomes they're saying should be used, because there needs to be some measure.
Yeah, you make a good point there. But I think my sympathy for that argument is mostly about not having a level playing field. You know, if you're failing public school, you stay open forever. You're given a million chances to reconstitute yourself. Whereas if you're failing charter school, they're going to shut you down. And I think that's unfair.
It certainly should not be one strike you're out.
Yeah, right. So where charters do poorly, weak state laws, overregulation, and underfunding are often the culprits, rather than bad educational outcomes. A 2011 study by the Center for Education Reform showed that nationally, the number one reason why charter schools close is financial, accounting for 42% of the closures. as opposed to academic, just 19%. A more recent study found that the 5-year overall closure rate for new charter schools was more than 25%, and the 15-year closure rate was about 50%. Those numbers don't look good, but the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools explains them this way. Quote, "These schools closed for a variety of reasons, including low enrollment, financial concerns, and/or low academic performance. The charter model gives charter schools the freedom to be more innovative while being held accountable for improving student achievement. School closures provide evidence that the accountability part of the charter model is being upheld." End quote. I think that's a good answer.
Yeah. And it's important to keep in mind, I think, that innovative doesn't always mean better. It just means you're trying something different.
Yes.
And different is in some cases going to be worse. And in that case, you shut it down and you try something different.
That's right. Yes. And different sometimes requires a little more slack to see if this works out.
Right.
So as you noted in your question, Mark, the performance of charter schools and the justification for their existence have been subject to fierce debate almost since their inception. Do charters point to new ways of teaching and learning, or at least increase competition in their districts, leading to higher test scores, standards, and overall achievement for all students? Or do they cannibalize already stretched state and local public education budgets, leading to worse outcomes? The data is all over the place, so it's hard to say for sure. But I'm sympathetic to some of the arguments made by the naysayers. Charter school critics argue that over time, what had started as a progressive experiment slowly shifted into a conservative project to undermine public education and attack teachers' unions. They accuse the various for-profit entities and private foundations that support charters, like those of your former employer, Bill and Melinda Gates, Eli and Edith Broad, and the Walton family, of treating public education as a quote-unquote business model that can turn a profit. The progressive education activist Jonathan Kozol warned in the pages of Harper's Magazine 15 years ago that the privatizing of public education is seen by many as the largest quote-unquote market opportunity since healthcare services were privatized in the 1970s. And as for labor practices, the noted education historian Diane Ravitch estimated in what she called a safe guess that 95% of American charters are non-union and follow unsustainable practices like requiring teachers to work unusually long hours. Their non-union status means that charter school teachers are exempt from their state's collective bargaining laws, so they don't have an effective way to redress grievances. As a result, the burnout rate is significant, and to make up for all those departing teachers, some charter schools hire faculty that don't meet state certification standards, thus, quote, deprofessionalizing what should be an honored and esteemed profession, end quote. If it's possible to know about a movement through the company it keeps, then some of the friends of charter schools are revealing. How about the real estate industry? Unlike regular public schools, the buildings in which charters operate are mostly owned by private landlords. The profiteers in the commercial real estate industry are enthusiastic backers of charter schools because they can lease space to charters at sky-high rent, then pay no property taxes while their facility is being used as a school. And how about right-wing billionaires? The Koch Family Foundation, the Walton Foundation, and Trump's Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, are major funders and proponents of charter schools and school choice generally. School choice basically means the option to allow students to select alternatives to public schools, usually by offering tax credits or vouchers to their families. Its backers see parents as consumers with a responsibility to choose the best possible school for their children. Charter schools are among an array of options that school choice advocates lobby for, including non-neighborhood schools, magnet schools, virtual schools, and homeschooling. I'll bet you didn't know that as of 2016, nearly 1.7 million children nationwide were homeschooled. That's 3.3% of all students, a number that has surely risen since the COVID pandemic. Did you know that, Mark?
That's a bigger number than I would have guessed if you'd asked me.
Me too.
And, I suppose for a while there, every child was being homeschooled because of COVID. And I guess it makes sense that some of those kids just wouldn't go back to schools when they reopened. I
didn't get a good number on that, but I'm quite certain that number is higher than it was before. And while we're on the basket of deplorables, so to speak, let's not forget the parasitic politicians who glom onto these movements to advance their careers. School choice dovetails with the more recent so-called parental rights movement that propelled a Republican to the governorship of Virginia and inspired recent book banning movements and the Don't Say Gay bill signed by that asshole in Florida. The school choice movement is mostly driven by conservatives, but not entirely. In 1990, the Democratic mayor of Milwaukee introduced school vouchers, an idea first championed by conservative economist Milton Friedman in the 1950s. When Cory Booker was the mayor of Newark, New Jersey in 2007, he expanded charter schools there. The Obama administration incentivized states and local school districts to increase the number of charter schools. Proponents of charters argue that they serve underserved communities looking for alternatives to their neighborhood schools. It's not hard to understand why interest in school choice is high in large urban centers like Milwaukee and Newark, whose chronically underfunded and deeply segregated school systems have been failing students and families for generations. After all, school choice should be popular in places where your local school sucks.
Right.
On top of that, many parents, after having been inundated with decades of talk about failing schools, now believe that any charter school is better than their catchment school, even when that's not true. Charters poll well whenever and wherever the question is asked. As of May 2022, 72% of American parents favored school vouchers and 71% favored charter schools in the United States.
Yeah, it makes sense to me that parents would largely be in favor of things that allow them to exercise some choice where the education of their kids is concerned. Because otherwise, you're just sending your kid off to the local educational monopoly and hoping for the best.
Agreed. And I also think there's a bit of the shiny object phenomenon here, right? So you know your local school isn't that good, or you've been told, and here's this shiny other thing called charter schools. Well, let's try that. That must be better, right? I favor that.
Yeah.
So I think there's some of that going on too. I want to talk about Diane Ravitch. She's the education historian I mentioned earlier. I think she's a really interesting figure in the debate about charter schools because of her changing views on this topic. Beyond her academic career, she served as Assistant Secretary of Education for President George Bush the Elder, and also as co-chair of the board of Common Core, one of the education reform groups funded by the Gates Foundation. She initially agreed with the focus on school choice, national curriculum standards, standardized testing, and the other free market reforms in No Child Left Behind, before famously renouncing her earlier support and becoming arguably the nation's most vociferous critic of school choice generally and charter schools specifically. I find her arguments to be credible because of the ideological journey she's taken. Ravitch now believes that charter school and testing reform movements were championed by right-wing think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, backed by billionaires, for the express purpose of destroying public education and teachers' unions. In her view, an initially well-meaning movement for better schools was co-opted by money men who didn't have the best interests of children at heart. I quote, Charter schools started with the idea that they would become R&D laboratories to help public schools. Instead, they've been taken over by private entrepreneurs with the idea that this is a great money stream. You can go to the bank with this commitment of government funds. And then in many places, they're trying to put public schools out of business. End quote. In her work, Ravitch frequently cites low-performing charters, the corruption, incompetence, and outright fraud of some of their operators, their exclusionary policies, and their poor results. She thinks the hyper-focus during the Clinton and Bush years on high-stakes testing, the creeping privatization represented by vouchers and charter schools, and the demonization of quote-unquote bad teachers didn't make things better. Countering the insistence that a sclerotic education bureaucracy was to blame for failing schools, she wrote that, quote, the best predictor of low academic performance is poverty, not bad teachers, end quote. She argued that bolstering early childhood education and subsidizing child care would go a lot farther to equalizing educational outcomes than the continued support of alternatives like charter schools. And yet, despite her skepticism about charter schools overall, Ravitch nonetheless acknowledged in her 2013 book, Reign of Error, The Hoax of the Privatization Movement and the Danger to America's Public Schools, that there's a space for well-conceived and well-run charter schools. She wrote, and I quote her again, to be sure, there are good community-based charter schools that do not skim the easiest to educate students and do not counsel out the students they don't want. Some are trying to fulfill the original vision of schools that fill a niche, doing something that public schools can't do or can't do well. Some are run by teachers or others seeking a refuge from the overscripted, hyper-regulated, and over-tested public schools. End quote. Later in the same book, she lays out a vision for how, quote, charters can be redesigned to serve the common good, end quote. Her conditions include banning the for-profit operation of schools and eliminating charter networks, whether for-profit or non-profit. Clearly, she's interested in separating public education from the filthy lucre extracted by some of those entrepreneurs. I think it isn't much of a stretch to go from Ravitch's persuasive criticism to a damning critique of capitalism, that the hullabaloo over charter schools was engineered by the self-proclaimed smartest guys in the room to divide and conquer the huge 90% majority of American families who send their kids to public school. Studies done by conservative and libertarian think tanks like the Cato Institute claim that privately run education costs less than public education, and the competition it stimulates produces better outcomes. They want to privatize schooling, plain and simple. For them, charter schools are a beachhead, a toehold in their assault on public education. That argument resonates with me, Mark. But that's not the argument I'm going to make to you today. Here's my view. I think there is a role for charter schools in addressing what's broken in public education. To state the obvious, the current system doesn't meet the needs of all children. As Becky told me, and I readily agree, if we had equitable, fully funded public school systems, we wouldn't need charter schools in the first place. But we don't, and so we need to avail ourselves of things that work, or at least show promise of working. Properly managed charter schools can make a difference in kids' lives, especially in impoverished urban and rural neighborhoods where the public schools are inadequate. I have no doubt that some of the funders and proponents of charter schools have the best interests of children at heart. Under the right school leaders and with a management group devoted not to profit but to children, a charter school's freedom to hire new people and try new things can lead to innovations that change the life trajectories of young people. I think there has to be a place for that kind of experimentation when the status quo is unacceptable, as it is in too many places in America.
Yeah, I totally agree that we need to start on this conversation with an understanding that the status quo is not enough.
Yes.
And so if you throw out charter schools and you just revert to a public school system, then you're reverting to something that is actively failing many communities.
Yes.
And what I referred to earlier, I think I read this a long time ago, but it's probably still true today, that America is number one in the world in terms of per capita spending on education and number 32 or 33 in the world in terms of educational outcomes.
Yeah.
And so innovation is required when something isn't working.
Yes.
And innovation doesn't mean, tearing everything down and starting over. It means creating a space where you try some big ideas.
Right.
And pivot away from the stuff that doesn't work and pivot towards the stuff that does.
Right.
And charter schools are the space where that can happen.
Exactly.
But it does not surprise me that this has been co-opted by bad actors, because everything,
yes,
eventually, sooner or later, everything is
right.
co-opted by bad actors.
I agree with you completely.
Yeah.
And all I would add is we must not throw out the baby with the bathwater, because there are some bad actors. We don't get rid of all charter schools. That's ridiculous. There are good charter schools, and charter schools point the way to the future teaching methods that could be good for the country. But let me just say, having said my piece about retaining good charter schools, I am troubled by the zero-sum game that is public school funding in our country. I think the ongoing bitter struggle between charter advocates and supporters of traditional public schools is a conflict that need not happen between constituencies that ought to be natural allies. The main problem, as I see it, is the way public schools are funded in this country. Public elementary and secondary schools receive money from local, state, and federal government in proportions that vary widely depending on where you live. According to data reported by CRS, the Congressional Research Service, in August 2019, state governments provide 47% of these revenues, local governments about 45%, and the federal government about 8%. The state revenue is generated from sources like corporate and personal income taxes, retail sales taxes, sin taxes on things like alcoholic beverages and tobacco products, and even lotteries. Locally, the primary revenue source comes from property taxes. And I want to linger on that local share for a moment. According to data from the 2016 U.S. Census, 72% of all local government tax revenues came from property taxes, which means that nearly 3 out of every $4 generated by a locality is dependent on its housing stock and the socioeconomic status of the people living in that housing. Localities in many states have discretion as to how high or low to set their property tax rate, leading to further discrepancies between the property tax bases in cities and towns, even within the same state. This, in a nutshell, is why there are huge differences in per-pupil funding between affluent and poor school districts. Property taxes are incubators of inequality. As bad as it is today, it used to be even worse. In the early 20th century, states began contributing to public school funding to mitigate what the CRS study called, quote, the high degree of inequality in revenues per pupil that would result if funding were based only on local taxable resources and the willingness of local citizens to tax themselves, end quote. Many charter schools are in poor, racially segregated communities that are forced to share their already meager public education budgets with those charters. Given that dynamic, it's not at all surprising that public and charter school advocates fight like hell over that budget, each camp seeing the conflict as existential in nature and the other camp as the enemy. I liken it to 2 starving dogs fighting over the crumbs from the master's table.
Right.
Of course, we don't have to pit charter schools against public schools. That's a choice we make that flows from the choice to fund public education via wildly disparate property taxes. A more enlightened society would assess much higher income and corporate taxes on its rich citizens who can afford to send their kids to private school, then use the proceeds to set up a more equitable funding mechanism so that all public schools have the resources they need. But as long as the two camps continue to fight over the table scraps, vilifying each other instead of joining together to work and vote for that more enlightened society, I'm afraid nothing will change.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think?
Well, you're speaking to a resident of the state of Washington where there is no income tax. And so here in particular, property tax is critically important. And sure, yeah. And poor communities just less able to fund common services. Seattle, where I live, is probably one of the better off communities in Washington because, of course, another previous episode of this podcast, the incredibly high price of housing in this community means that there's a very high level of property value that can be assessed for taxes. And so the revenues are flowing in. Seattle's doing okay.
Right.
But some of these outlying communities that you drive through along I-5 on the way to Portland, I can't even imagine how they patch roofs when leaks spring and how they bring in teachers, because how much can they possibly raise through taxation that is just going against dilapidated farms and houses that haven't been renovated since the 60s?
Yep, and that what you just described is happening all over the country. And we need to change the system of how we fund public schools if we're going to see public schools improve, most importantly, but if we're also going to see this warfare between public schools and charter schools go away. Mm-hmm. We simply have to change the funding.
So if I can use a metaphor, which I think might irritate you a little bit.
Okay.
The system we have for funding education right now is kind of like Major League Baseball, where each team draws on the revenues of its local community. And cities like teams in New York have much greater revenue sources than teams in St. Louis. And what you're proposing is that we go to more like a system like the NFL, where funds are pooled and then distributed equally.
Well, boy, that is so clever of you to make me go on record supporting the NFL, which you know I hate, you bastard. But you're right. I must grudgingly admit you are correct about that. That it's, the ownership groups in big cities are bigger and richer, and that's also true of parent groups. My kids were lucky enough to go to some good public schools in Manhattan, New York City, and some of the people running the PTA there were people who would be running Fortune 500 companies if they weren't deciding to opt out for a little while to run the PTA. So it really is a tale of two cities all over the place. And I agree that, some enforced equality is the way to go here.
Right.
So, yeah, bring the NFL method to schools. Let's just keep out the brain bashing and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, right?
Yeah, bring the NFL method to schools, but with fewer concussions. I think we can agree on that.
Yeah.
So to sum up what you're saying here, we need some method of reforming and improving public education. Charter schools probably has to be a part of that, but we need accountability for charter schools, and we need probably some legislation saying that they should not be profit-driven. Yes, that's what I think. Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable point of view. So I hope I answered your question. You did. Thank you. Now it makes sense to me. Now I can take that question out of the back of my mind. I can check it off as resolved and get on with my life. So thank you for that. And do you have a question for me for next time? I do. This is a more subjective question than we usually tackle on this podcast. Okay. So I had a few, not doubts so much as wondering, okay, this is a different kind of question, but I think it's a really interesting question. I think we're both going to enjoy it. So in one of our early episodes of Mansplaining, episode 9 to be precise, which we taped in November 2020, I asked you whether movie theaters were going to disappear someday. Remember that? Yeah, that's one of my favorites. Yeah, that was a really interesting discussion. I've never been a big fan of going to the movies, but I am a big fan of TV.
and I have been for as long as I can remember. And it seems to me, Mark, that in recent years, the offerings on TV are a lot more compelling than what we get at the movies.
Yeah.
I think you can even make a plausible argument for the last 10 or 15 years being the golden age of television.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So I put this question to you. Has the small screen supplanted the big screen? Or put another way, is television capturing the cultural zeitgeist like movies once did, but no longer do?
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm going to have to give some thought on how to frame that. Like what an answer to that question would even look like. So that will be stimulating. Thank you.
And it is subjective, of course. This will be your theory, as opposed to throwing facts at me. But I welcome this kind of conversation. I think it'll be really interesting.
Me too. So that's it for this week. If you have any thoughts on this episode, or if you'd like to leave comments or questions or
fan mail, hate mail.
Less hate mail, but I mean, we've received both, frankly, on the Facebook page, but we prefer the former to the latter. Yeah,
and listen, if you're going to put white powder in the envelope, folks, make sure it's talcum powder and not anthrax.
Yeah. Yeah, please don't make the mistake of accidentally putting anthrax in that envelope. Keep your talcum powder separate from your anthrax so that you don't accidentally mail it to us. And thank you for that.
Well put. Yes.
So you can find that Facebook page at Mansplaining the Podcast. It's a place where you can come by, give a like to our page, recommend it to your friends, and maybe even suggest a topic for a future episode. If you'd like to help other people discover this podcast, you can help us out by going to your podcast platform of choice, be it Spotify or Apple or Amazon or Google, wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a review. Give us 5 stars if we deserve it. And maybe write some nice things about us. That allows other people to discover Mansplaining the Podcast, and we do love it when our audience grows a little bit bigger.
We do. And if you're low tech, we have some sandwich boards that we can provide you with to wear on the street.
Yes, yeah. Just march up and down the street shouting mansplaining. But that's it. I'm Mark. That was Joe. And thank you for spending some time with us.
We'll talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.